Hi there, I'm George Agnew and I'm going to be taking you on a walk today round part of the Rougham estate with my dog Bolly, who you can hear barking. Um, this is one of my favourite walks and it's called the Lake Meadows walk, and it goes through some very, very beautiful ancient meadows at the far end, which are really an extraordinary treat to experience. And so I very much look forward to showing them to you. So we're going to set off on the walk now and see what we can find. Here we go. Bolly will appear on the screen in a minute. There's Bolly. He absolutely loves its walks, as you can imagine. It's a dog. And so, as usual, we're setting off from the Blackthorpe barn and we are going to be crossing the Blackthorpe barn car park, which is not terribly exciting, and so we won't make a great deal of anything of that, but fairly shortly we will be entering the Downs Wood on the other side of the car park. Car park here surrounded by its own ancient meadows. The one there which I'm filming at the moment is called Rookery Meadow. It has some horses that live there now, and you can see there are dead trees, dying trees, living trees, a whole sequence of things across the meadow. Dead wood, as I've said on previous films, is terribly important for the environment, much more than you might imagine, because the decaying timber provides habitat for thousands of different types of minute creatures and larger insects, and then birds come and feed on them, and it becomes a whole ecosystem in its own right. So where possible, we try to leave the timber where it falls and not to try and clear it up, which would be the natural tendency and what used to happen here historically in the old days. People used to take a pride in how neat and tidy everything could be. We still try to keep things tidy where we can, but I think we have a different standard and a different expectation of what tidiness actually means now. We allow weeds to grow in certain situations, and the definition of weed, of course, is a questionable thing, because what is a weed? It's a plant growing in the wrong place, but is it really wrong? We don't know. So we're about to set off into the Downs Wood now, which is the first part really of this walk, which is it's a feature of many of these walks going through this wood, because it's the first really lovely spot leading away from the barn. And I come here so often, sometimes it's quite hard to remember quite how beautiful it is. But making these little films makes me look at it with new eyes. And we've got lots of trees of different ages, which I've talked about before. But one thing maybe I was just noticing now is the oak in front of us here. You see that? It's all covered in ivy. And a lot of people worry about that and think that that's going to kill the tree. In fact, it very seldom does. It just provides a whole new world of life that lives within the tree. I mean, statistically, an oak tree is supposed to provide habitat for hundreds of different types of insects. And that's fantastic, and it's probably one of the richest habitats you can get. But when you add on top of that all the habitats provided by ivy, you can increase that really quite significantly. We're just waiting for Bolly, who's having a good old sniff at something here. And I have to try to balance out this walk with his entertainment needs. Come on, Polly, I don't really think we can just keep doing this. Come on. Because this wood is not an ancient wood, and because it's near quite a lot of houses, there are various things growing in here which are probably not really native. And they include bits of rhododendron, which you can see here, and box, and some holly trees. The holly trees can be native, and may very well be. In fact, this holly tree here is probably native. But it helps to widen the diversity of things in the wood. And I'd just like to point out that the first snowdrops are appearing now, and I just think they are so lovely. And they're a harbinger of spring, of course, and of the whole year ahead. Such an exciting time when all the plans for the year are just beginning to start. Nothing's gone wrong yet. I always feel that it's a great time. You know, as the year goes on, all sorts of bits of things happen. You have schemes, and some of them don't quite work out. Some of them don't work out at all. Other things work brilliantly. But at this time of year, I always think when you see the snowdrops, all our plans for our gardens and things like that, they can still be perfect in our mind's eye. And that's why one of the reasons why I love to see them so much. Of course, they are really beautiful in their own right. And we have them dotted around the estate. Near Rougham Hall, there are thousands of them, which were clearly planted as part of garden improvements. And here on bits of woodland, you find little clumps, some of which I suspect have been dumped as part of a load of maybe garden rubbish or something. There were a few bulbs in there, and they somehow found their way into the ground. Other places they've clearly been planted, but either way they're just absolutely beautiful. It's another winter's day. Today we don't have brilliant sunlight. It's all rather overcast. But actually it gives different light conditions which have their own benefits. And we can see the woodland probably with the camera in a better way. You can see all the different types of trees, the stumps, conifers, the oaks, other trees, the stumps, the brambles, and leading us through the wood, the path. Today's walk is going to take us to some really, really ancient meadows called Lake Meadows, and they are populated with some of the most iconic trees on the estate. And to go there is like entering a sort of time warp. And it's a real treat. It's a little bit more of a walk today to achieve this. I'm estimating it's about an hour and 45 minutes, or hour and a half maybe, depending on your speed of walking and how often your dog stops, and how long you stand looking at whatever you're seeing. But it gives some sort of an idea of the amount of time required or to be allocated for trying to do the walk. I haven't actually been on this walk for several months, in fact not since last summer, and so it'll be interesting for me to see what changes there are as we go along. There's a whole load more dead wood here, which I'm always pleased to see. The wind's getting up a bit, and we'll have to see how that affects us on this walk. There's supposed to be a bit of a storm coming, I think, into Norway later in the day, and the Norwegian Weather Service has, I think, announced a storm and given it a name, which I'm afraid I can't remember. But I think it's going to be quite breezy here as well. And so as we come to the end of January, we're going to be going out with a bit of a blast. One of the features of this walk as well is that it can be quite muddy, one particular spot in one of the lake meadows where all the cattle tend to congregate and trample the ground. And so I would strongly recommend boots are worn for this walk, unless you're in the very height of summer. And even then you might be surprised how muddy it can be. Well, we're coming towards the end of the Downs Wood now, having turned right at the end, passing another collapsed tree that came down in a recent gale, and heading off across the edge of the fields. One of the things about this is that we now have sheep grazing here, which we didn't have before. The sheep don't belong to the estate, but they come here and graze fields that have been largely sown with a cover crop, which enables them to generate nitrogen and that sort of thing during the winter months. It stops the nutrients leaching out of the ground. This is usually done where it's a spring crop that's going to be planted, and so over the winter we have these sheep coming to eat the cover crop, and all their droppings go back into the ground, and so the cycle is maintained. And it's really quite an unusual sight for us who have lived in Rougham for a long time to see sheep here, because we don't have any sheep and haven't had since, I think, the 1920s. There used to be a flock of sheep in those days, but they became ill, and in the end we had to close down the flock at that time. I don't know a great deal of detail about it, but since then sheep have been a rare sight here at Rougham. The left front Rougham church tower is beginning to appear, and we will be going past that on our walk. We've got the hedge line here on the left. You can see where it's been trimmed. I can see some long-tailed tits in the hedge, and listening out for the sound of running water, because it's the place where there's always running water, and I'm hoping to see that in a minute and hear it in a minute. We're passing some of these iconic oak trees of Rougham, and the oak really is almost the symbol of Rougham. We have so many here, so many scattered across the landscape, and so many in the woods. The wind's blowing a bit, and because of that I can actually hear children at the primary school with the sound of their talking, shouting, playing, coming across on the air from really quite a long way off. It's amazing how sound travels, but if there's a little bit of wind. On the right front, which is not the way we're actually going to be going, but I would like to just point out, it doesn't look very wonderful at the moment, but we have literally just almost finished planting a hedge. And this is a new hedge going along the edge of a public footpath, which has always been very open in the past. We've had oak trees growing in the verge of the hedge for quite a while, and so they're beginning to establish. But we've now filled the gaps up with hedge plants, which I hope you can see there. They're all planted in little plastic tubes. We all hate plastic, but this plastic does a very good job. It keeps a little environment around each plant, hedge plant. Here we are. Here's the water coming under the bridge. Can't resist a little bit of filming of it. If you can hear that, see that. Such a lovely sound, such a lovely sound. Now we head on up towards the church. These little tubes, you can see some, I'll show you some here that are a few years old, where we planted, gapped up a little bits of hedge here a year or two ago. You see these little spiral plastic bits around the bases of these plants. What they do is they keep rabbits, it's particularly rabbits, but also deer, from chewing the new plants. When the plants first go in, they seem to taste particularly good, and they always get grazed by rabbits. And if you don't put a protection like that around them, you can lose the whole lot. Really, you can. It's hard to believe that it would happen, but you can actually lose hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of plants over a period of a few weeks. And all the rabbit's got to do is to eat the bark around the tree, or the plant, the bush, the shrub, and it will die. That's the end of it. And all your effort has been for nothing. And so we have to have this protection on these trees for 3 years, maybe 3-4 years. It also helps to show where the plants are if you're having to do some clearing of growth. In the summer, sometimes the embryonic hedge line can get absolutely smothered in maybe nettles and thistles and all sorts of other plant material, and you sometimes have to cut it back to give the new hedge a chance to get going, because obviously you're trying to artificially create a line of trees, and so you have to give it whatever help you can. Here we are now, walking along an old bit of hedge line, which is thick and wonderful habitat for wildlife, and provides shelter when one walks, and shade in the summer. It's a lovely thing. It's a lovely thing. Of course, before the Second World War, the hedgerows in this country were absolutely everywhere, and field sizes were really small. Here in Rougham, I dare say an average field would have been 4 or 5 acres maybe, and because all the equipment used to do the farming, it was either done manually or it was done with horse-drawn equipment or very, very small tractor in the latter stages. It was easy enough to get in and farm these little tiny fields. But after the Second World War, there was a huge push to make farming more efficient. The war had resulted in food shortages, of course, and I mean, famously, rationing was a big feature of life all over the place, and also very much here in this country. In fact, I think bread ration only came in after the Second World War was over, and the rationing went on early into the 1950s. And so there was an enormous sense that people needed more food, and it was the duty of farmers to grow as much food as possible to try and feed the population. And they were sort of seen as heroic people for doing that, so that, you know, things could go off the ration and you could buy what you needed. And one of the aspects of it was that agricultural machinery came more and more into play, and particularly probably American agricultural machinery, where fields were far, far bigger. And there was increasing pressure to increase the sizes of fields in this country. The government subsidised people to remove hedgerows. It seems shocking now, but that's what happened. And some places were very keen on this and removed huge quantities of their hedges. At Rougham, we were really rather cautious about it. My grandfather was rather old-fashioned in his attitudes. Was reluctant to remove hedges, and he was reluctant to introduce artificial fertilizer and spray chemicals. And so now one would see him as being probably an environmental hero. At the time, he was thought of as being very old-fashioned. My father used to say that when you reached the Rougham estate, you could see the boundary because there were so many weeds growing in the fields. And I think for him that was an embarrassment. He was of the generation that saw this as the opposite of the way forward. And so when he got in charge, he did remove some hedges, but he was very modest in his removal. And so the average field size here at Rougham is probably now 10 acres, maybe 10 or 12 acres, having gone up from maybe 5. And so doubling the size, but by the standards of today, these fields are really very small. And I think our farm staff struggle quite often with combines and things like that, and various bits of farm equipment to get round them. But nevertheless, we are also replanting hedgerows and planting newly hedgerows in places that never had them before, where we think that there's a benefit to be had. And so that's what you see there. We're planting 1.2 kilometres of hedge, I think, this year. We don't do it every year, but every few years we have a hedge planting campaign. And that's what's happening now. We're passing the school where you can hear a lot of children in the playground, and approaching Rougham Church again, which is appearing in front of us. Cautiously we cross the road, nothing coming, and then we go through the church gate. Yew trees here already showing signs of new growth, which is, it's good, but it probably is an indication of climate change. Really they shouldn't be growing so much at the moment. Approaching the base of the church tower, which we think was built in the 14th century. A huge appeal for money. Various wealthy families contributed most of the money. The Drury family around here were the people whose their names on the tower, and they funded a lot of it. Church is open today, so we're not going in today, but we will on another occasion. Now we're passing the base of the tower. Just go and look to the very top of it. Magnificent sight, visible for miles across the landscape. and now heading through the churchyard in a westerly direction. Past more yew trees. These yew trees aren't particularly ancient, but some churchyards have the most incredibly ancient yew trees growing in them that are thousands of years old. And probably some of them may even predate Christianity. Churches were often built on old pagan sites of worship and that sort of thing, and so it's quite possible that you could have yew trees that predate the church. Here we have the Harvest Fair gate with its initials, Rougham Harvest Fair, and the date 1981. My brother ran a fair to raise money for his charity, Green Deserts, which happened on the spinney field just opposite the church. Absolutely beautiful location with the church as a backdrop and a view up under the lime trees, with all these people coming from all over the country and from abroad to celebrate music and alternative lifestyles as they were seen at the time, and helping to raise money for the charity. And Green Deserts, the objects of Green Desert were largely to help to plant shelter belts of trees on the edges of the desert to help to stop the desert spreading. So places like the Sahara, little patches in the Sahara Desert. Sudan was one of the places my brother worked. And they planted a thing called mesquite, which was a very, very hardy, a hardy plant, which would, I think it was fertile. I seem to remember the seeds of the mesquite would get eaten as fruit by goats. Goats are the things that spread the desert, sheep and goats, probably more than anything else, because they would tend to nibble off any growth that appeared. And so they were the problem, and they were also seen to be a little bit of the solution in this case, because they would eat the seeds of the mesquite, and then when their droppings came out the other end, there were little fertile patches of goat dropping with a seed in it, which could come to life. And so they collected all these plants up and created a tree nursery. And when they were ready, they planted them out in shelter belts. That was the vision of Green Deserts. As with so many visions of the 60s and 70s, they were very idealistic and wonderful, sometimes not wildly practical. There is the row of poplar trees which marches across the landscape here, and more water in the ditch as we go along. I can begin to hear a bit of a sound of wind now, which is actually quite dramatic when you know it's going to get stronger. But we're sheltered by the hedge, and this is absolutely perfect arrangement. This is one of the practical demonstration of what a hedge can do, even in the winter when the leaves are off almost all the plants. We've still got a real ability to reduce the wind speed. If one had to sleep out here or something, or animal has to sleep out here on a windy day or windy night, it will shelter under the bottom of a hedge very often to stay warm, because the wind speed will be so much lower down there. Today's walk is going to take us to the left when we get to the top of this path, which is leading away from the church. We have on our left, we have a pond that we've recently restored a few years ago. It's highly successful, it's full of water, and a wonderful source of water for wildlife to come and drink, but also for wildlife to live in. And so you get extraordinary increase in wildlife when you add a pond into the mix. In Rougham, I think we have something like 35 ponds in various stages of good health or badly maintained. I mean, over the years, I'm afraid a lot of them got rather left, as was the way with most places in Suffolk, or even in England, I would think. But over the last few years, there's been a real effort to try to bring them back to life. A lot of them got poplar trees planted round them, when poplars were seen to be one of the economic solutions for the future. Bryant and May, the matchmaking people, encouraged farmers to plant poplar trees, and they intended that they were going to use them to make matches 30 years later or something. The breakup of Eastern Europe resulted in access to timber from places like Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and other places, probably Poland and other countries too. And suddenly it was much, much cheaper to get this rather unglamorous timber from these places rather than scrapping around all around the English countryside collecting up poplar trees. So these trees, I think one has to remember that they were intended as a crop, and they're hybrid poplars. They're not an ancient species. They still have definite value in the landscape, but they were planted as a crop, much in the same way as you would a crop of wheat, just with a longer life cycle. Because they were never required for the matches, they just carried on growing, and everybody got so used to them in the landscape that it's been a bit of a shock when we've had to remove some. Now we're coming up to the T-junction here on this walk, and today, quite excitingly, we're turning left, which means we're going on a longer walk, and we're crossing a footbridge over another stream. It's not very glamorous, but you see there a land drain, the water running out, which is the sort of thing which is helping to drain a field, and it's these ditches which gradually come into streams that flow into rivers and are part of the water system for the countryside. Now here on the left now you can see this line of poplar trees I was just talking about, now forming a landscape feature along the horizon. And they are, I'm afraid to say, not going to be able to stay up for very many more years. But when they come down, we will definitely be replanting them with oak trees, no doubt, and some other varieties which we hope will be sustainable into the future. Maybe sweet chestnut, maybe lime, maybe other introduced species. Hickory has been discussed as a possible option for the future. False acacia has been suggested. False acacia is a tree of southern Europe, and as things warm up, trees of that sort become significant possibilities. I'm just going to pan round because it's such a beautiful view here. There's Rougham Church hidden behind the poplar trees, and then go all the way around a couple of pylons which don't exactly enhance the view, and then there's this hedgerow. And we were looking along the side of the hedgerow, along the edge of the field, heading on our way to Lake Meadows. This is quite interesting. I've just spotted here a little hole in the hedge, which is where probably deer go through from one side to the other. When doing this walk, you need to keep your eyes peeled along here because There's going to be a right turn in a moment onto another footpath, which is perfectly well signed, but the path we're on is so inviting, and it just seems to go on, that you think, oh well, it must surely be down there, but actually we're going to be turning right shortly. There's another walk, or several other walks, where we go on down this path, but today's walk's a little different, has its own objective. I can see the opening in the hedge on our right front here. It's about 20 metres ahead, and I think there's probably a footpath sign indicating the route. And there's a gap in the hedge and a little bridge. So this is where we turn right, and there is a sign here showing the footpath which is attached to the timber of the bridge. So we're going to be crossing here, and this is where we go. Ollie's found something interesting yet again. He's reluctant to come along, but I'm sure he will in a moment. Here we go. And now we're walking along the edge of another field with a fairly low trimmed hedge on our left. A couple of ancient oaks in it. Some houses. We are making our way along this field line up to the public road at the far end, where we will literally just go straight across. It's not much walking on tarmac roads on this walk. I'm quite excited to see what I shall find when we actually get to the Lake Meadows, because, as I said, I haven't been here on this particular walk for many months, and there are always new things to be found. I mean, it may be something's blown down across the path, it may be cattle are blocking the route. So I've had that before, and I'll explain what you can do to avoid that if that should happen to you when we get there. The public road is looming ahead. I think I can hear a car coming, so something will come past in a moment which will show the location of the road. And here it goes. Yes, there's a car. And I have to get Bolly onto a short lead now for crossing the road. There he is, a very nice short lead. See him walking along. Now we approach the public road. You can see here it is. It's clear in both directions, so we can cross. Straight across, and there's a footpath sign here to show us the route. And so we continue along this wider strip of grassland and approach, rather curiously, a hedge line end on. Doesn't do that very often. Which has a wonderful ancient oak tree marking this end of it. Trying to spot a kite which just flew over, but it seems to have disappeared now. Now, here we are. Here is the end of this bit of hedge line, and what you have to remember here is to walk on the right hand side, because this is the footpath, and there is a footpath sign to indicate this, which I'm showing now. And you can see these wonderful old gnarled oak trees. We're beginning to get into the really old world of the estate and the estate landscapes along here. We walk along here for a little bit, and then rather surprisingly you have to walk through the middle of the hedge and pop out the other side, which is something to just watch out for as we go along here. It's been a couple of 100 meters or something like that. And there's some younger trees here. It's always good to see younger trees growing in the hedge line, not just ancient things. And you can see here this hedge has been trimmed not so long ago, probably this, I'm sure it must have been this winter, as part of its maintenance cycle. And we're approaching Lake Meadows, which are very beautiful set of meadows on the estate. And hopefully will be a treat for any walker along here. This wide strip of grassland is really rather nice to walk along. I'm beginning to look out for this hole in the hedge now, because I can perfectly easily walk past it, miss it. I think I can see it ahead, about 30 meters ahead, something like that. See if I'm right. Yes, this is the hole in the hedge. So what you have to do here, you can see there's a little gap, a little tiny bridge, and there's a sign, and you have to go through here. And emerge on the other side and turn right. And this is the footpath. This is the footpath here. And I can see that ahead of us there are some walkers with the dog. We won't go too quickly, give them a chance to keep their distance and maybe draw away from us. And this gives an opportunity to show the way to cross one of these stiles. So what we've got here is a stile with a gap on the left to allow a dog to get through on the left. So you just have to persuade the dog to do it. Right, boll it, go to the left, through there, that's it. And then another thing to do is to pass the lead underneath. Sorry, you probably couldn't really see that, but you pass the lead underneath the fence, and then you climb over the stile yourself using the hand posts to support yourself, and then you're over. And this is the beginning of Lake Farm Meadows. This is not the most dramatic of the meadows, it's probably the most boring of them, but there's a path which runs diagonally across this meadow, and ahead of it we enter into a little triangular meadow, and then probably what I would describe as the main meadow, which is the real feature of the walk. Ground's a little wet. We've had such a wet autumn. And, we're getting into different sort of soil type here on the estate. As we go further south, it gets more clayey, which retains moisture for much longer. And I did mention the need for good boots on this walk, and I think that might be demonstrated fairly shortly. Lots of molehills here. And we can see the branches that have fallen off these old trees, and then clumps of brambles and things creating their own little ecosystem. Hollow stumps, hollow trunks, dead trees, half dead trees, live trees, as we go along. Now we see a metal gate ahead of us, not one of the more beautiful gates on the estate, but it's a functional thing, and this will lead us through into the next meadow. The next meadow here is a tiny little triangular meadow, which if I pan round you can see it's not very big at all. The whole thing is perhaps 100 meters one along the long side. And if you can imagine, we used to have fields, arable fields that were this sort of size. You can sort of understand why people felt the need to get rid of some of these hedges for a farming purpose. And one of the reasons why these have survived as they have in a meadow is that there isn't the same demand for access by big agricultural equipment at all. And so one of the things about keeping livestock on these meadows is that it helps to make it possible to keep all the old hedgerows. And for that I think we have to be very grateful. I mean, I'm not a beef eater myself. I don't really eat that. But by the beef production, running cattle in these meadows is actually what keeps them going. We're going through the little narrow gap now into the next meadow. Sometimes this bit is blocked by cattle standing here. Today we can get through nice and easily. On a previous occasion I got here and I couldn't get through, and I had to turn right in that little triangle and walk a different route there. The notes for this walk actually give details of how to do that if you should find that happening. But today we've got through into this wonderful ancient meadow, and now we're going to walk slowly through it and have a look at some of the trees as we go. We might even do a bit of a tree portrait, possibly, when we get to one of the big ones, because they are terribly special. And there are in this meadow, I haven't really actually counted them, there must be 15 maybe ancient oak trees growing in here. And it's an absolute delight. I mentioned about mud earlier. When we went through that gap in the little triangular, the end of the triangular meadow before entering this one, it was actually quite dry. So it shows how wrong you can be, but it's actually a good idea to be prepared, because sometimes you get to a situation where it's a lot muddier than you expect, and what's been a delightful walk can suddenly become a bit of an assault course, perhaps you could say. So now I'm looking at some of these trees. There's an amazing one here with an enormous bole. That's the bit up at about 12 feet up, which is where all the branches are coming out from. And that's where it would have been pollarded in the old days. They would have done this to generate timber for shipbuilding and house building, and also bits of firewood. They wouldn't take all the branches off in a year. They might take one off every 5 years, or 10 years even. You can see there's a hollow in the middle there, straight in front of us, which quite likely has something living in it. This is the sort of thing which an oak tree can do, provide all this extraordinary habitat. It's a huge, huge, huge tree. Absolutely vast. I can't bend over back enough to actually get to the top of it from where I'm standing. And then we might go and have a look at this one, which is much, much smaller and is totally hollowed out, and only sort of half of it is really still here. Look at this. Isn't that extraordinary? Just look at it. Let's go and have a look. And that's still alive. And it's this outer edge of the tree which provides all the living material in a tree. When a tree grows, the centre of it really isn't doing terribly much. It just provides support, whereas all the activity is going on around the edge, the bark and the area just inside the bark of the tree. And so this tree, viewed from this side, looks amazingly okay. If you look at it from here, you wouldn't really guess that it's completely hollow and only half of it's still there. But this is all part of the ancient landscape of these woods. Ahead of me now there's another one. It's a great big hollow in the side of it. It's part of a group of 3 trees. And then over here we have some more. Huge bole of this oak tree here. Again, you can see the pollarding always happening at about the same height, sort of 12 foot. Maybe that was the height that they had a ladder or something like that which governed this. So you have this huge base, and then this plethora of branches higher up. And then over here on the right, a different sort of tree again. Again, an oak with an enormous bowl of growth here on the left-hand side, and still perfectly alive. And on this side, again, hollow. Very, very hollow. But the tree's still alive and may very well be for hundreds of years yet. It's really quite healthy. Then in the distance over there, you can see the stump of one that is dead and has been perhaps dead for a couple of 100 years. Time moves very slowly around here. This is an absolute time warp, this meadow. And there's another trunk there, which is probably even more ancient, because there's hardly anything left. But now we're going to find our way out of this meadow using another stile. And there's a pond here on the left. Pond for cattle. But the pond for cattle is also a pond for wildlife. And so you can see the brambles and things growing around the edge. The front here is quite shallow so that the cattle can get in to drink, but it means other creatures can get in and out of the water, and they won't drown in it by not being able to get out when they need to. It's perhaps a little bit overgrown on the south side, but there's a lot of light coming in from where I'm standing. Right, I'm just going to unravel the dog lead, and then we're going to go through, Bolly knows the way through this stile. So he goes through first, and then I pass the lead through, as we did before, keeping it locked so it won't suddenly open out. And then I go over the stile myself, using the handle here. So I went over it using this thing to hang on to, and I stepped over the stile. It's not actually that difficult. Obviously, for some people who are not very bendy, it may be a little bit too much of a challenge. Now we are at an area called Eastlow Hill, and the road here, which is a public road, leads on in a few minutes to a wonderful green lane system, which is going to be the next part of the walk. The road's very quiet, so I don't think it's something which is nasty as part of the thing. Now here on our left front, yet more meadows, more ancient oak trees in. We're not going through there today, we will on another walk, but that's not part of today's route. Obviously we're walking on the right hand side of this narrow single track road, so we can see something coming ahead of us. But vehicles don't move along here very quickly on the whole, so it's not too much of a challenge, though you can never guarantee what people are going to be up to, so do take care. I'm keeping my ears peeled for sounds of vehicles from both front and back. I think something is coming along now. So I'm going to pull over to the side. Oh, Bolly, hold over. It's a tractor. With a load of sheep. That's it's more sheep being taken to our meadows, I think. Or to our fields, they're not meadows where they're grazing. And here we go along here. If it wasn't for the tarmac, I would just say this is the most beautiful green lane, really. On the left hand side through the hedge you can just about make out yet another meadow. Even more beautiful old ancient trees. This part of the estate is very rich in this sort of thing. Now here I'm just noticing on my left front amazing growth of fungi on this tree stump. We had to take this tree down a few years ago because it was in danger of blowing down across the road, and it's been an absolute upsurging of fungal growth, which actually shows that the root system of the tree was not healthy. The stump itself, of course, is now standing dead wood in its own right, and bearing in mind the entire root system there is under the ground, which is quietly rotting away, this is all good stuff. All good stuff. So when you see a stump, that's not, in a way, that's not really even the end, because there's the whole decaying process of everything below that going on, and all the wildlife forms that are relying on that for their existence. I can begin to see the edge of the green lane that's going to take us back towards the Blackthorpe Barn in a minute, but it's not quite yet. There's a field, arable field on our right, with pond in the middle, which we're not going to go and look at today. But walking along here, Bolly keeps towing me along. Now on our left front is quite interesting. You can see this is also an area where wildlife crosses through the ditch, and there's water standing in the ditch at the bottom, but deer and things like that will cross over there. The area here is ancient not just because of these pollarded trees, but also because of the presence of the Romans here. There is a villa site in this vicinity. There are Roman burial mounds, which I'm now just going to go over and show you. Here, in front on that hedge line ahead of you, there is actually a thing called Eastlow Hill tumulus. Hard to see it really, but stands about 20 feet high. It would have been much higher in the old days. It was excavated in the middle of the 19th century and contains a building within it with its own roof, and within that there was a burial of a figure in a lead coffin. And it's almost certainly a Christian burial, which indicates that it's probably the sort of latter period of the Romans here. And the excavation was recorded by a man called John Henslow, who was a famous antiquarian, archaeologist and man of letters who taught at Cambridge University. He taught Charles Darwin. He helped found Cambridge Botanic Gardens. And he was involved in this excavation. Well, he ran this excavation along with that of 3 other tumuli in the area. Sadly, even though his efforts were much better than most, they weren't really very scientific by today's standards, and an enormous amount of material has been lost, despite the fact that he recorded everything he did. It is our hope one day to re-excavate this tumulus and see what we can find and record it, and maybe create a little visitor centre nearby here. And now we are approaching Whitebridge Lane on our right. You can see a footpath sign going off to the right, and this is where we are very, very nearly 100% sure there was a Roman road. This is part of what is described as Roman Road 33A, which is the road that runs from Chelmsford to Ixworth, and from there on forms part of Peddar's Way. Behind these trees that you're looking at now is the Eastlow Hill tumulus, which we will visit on a separate walk. But we're panning round now and looking down Whitebridge Lane, which is the route of today's walk. So this is Roman Road 33A. Doesn't sound very glamorous like that, but it's a very, very beautiful route. And it would have been a very important route in the old days, taking everybody that needed to go from London, perhaps up to Lincolnshire and the north of England, because from Ixworth there was a Roman fortress there guarding the junction in the Ways, and there were a number of roads which led off from there, one of which is now known as Peddar's Way, and that itself went up to the Wash, and from the Wash you would take a ferry across the water to the other side to Lincolnshire, and then carry on up to the north of England. So this is like we're walking along something that's a bit like the A1 here. Doesn't feel like it, fortunately. So much more delightful. The ditch has recently been dug out here, which we have to do from time to time to keep the water rolling and flowing. You can see how that's been done, and the hedge has been trimmed on the right, probably, I'm not sure if it was this year or last year. On the left it will be done at a different time. It had to be cut back to enable access to the ditch. Some people think it's a terrible thing to dig out ditches, but the whole water system here in the area is dependent on a system of ditches, and if you don't dig them out, as I know to my cost, because for a while we didn't do it here, the whole thing grinds to a halt. Get standing water flooding people's gardens, flooding roads, crops don't grow in fields, and it becomes quite tricky. So you really have to reinstigate a ditching system where in rotation you dig out bits of ditch around the place, so that every 7 or 8 years all the ditches have been dug out, maybe once. Things block ditches like fallen timber, silt, bits of rubbish, soil, weeds growing in the soil, and before long you've lost the effectiveness of the ditch almost completely. People would argue that wetland is now an important thing, and we ought to perhaps not let all the ditches run, and that is absolutely right. There are places where we can deliberately maybe block up a ditch to create a new pond or create a new wetland habitat. But if one's going to continue farming at all, you have to be able to drain the fields. And this field here on our left will be drained into this ditch. These white posts that you see ahead of you are where there are land drains. So that's a drain under the ground which takes water, which emerges here. Let's see if I can see the land drain here. Actually, I can't. Yes, I can. It's down there. Below the post, there's a little pipe coming out. It's not actually running at this moment, but I'm sure it has been running recently. On the right here, there is another little pond. We'll just go and have a quick look at it, which is quite pretty. It's not big, but it's doing a really good job. There's a pond and standing in the middle of the field. And this pond here, I think, is delightful. Look at that. Is that not really, really beautiful? Just a little feature of what we've got here on this Whitebridge Lane trackway. We'll cross back into Whitebridge Lane and then turn right and continue down it on our way back. It is quite muddy along here because the digger used to dig out the ditch has obviously had to go backwards and forwards along here, and it's, I'm afraid, cut up the surface a bit. So this is an example of the slightly unexpected bits of mud. I wasn't anticipating this, but I was anticipating more mud in the Lake Meadows themselves than actually I found. Here are some sheep corralled, waiting for something to happen, and their owner will come and do something, I'm sure, in the very near future. He's clearly on site. We saw him drive past a few minutes ago. These sheep spend a lot of their year at Ickworth, the National Trust property, where there are hundreds of acres of grassland which they graze. And we say they come here for their holidays in the winter. So they're getting a change of scene, a change of food, because they're eating these cover crops here. And then as these various fields get grazed down, they have to be moved from one field to another, and eventually back they go to Ickworth again. Now in the bottom of the ditch here, I've just noticed there's some bracken, which is always a sign of a slightly different soil type, often rather sandy around here. You can almost work out the geology by looking for bracken and work out the patches of sand. Here we can see very clearly the land drains emerging from the field. There's one. There's this marker post on this side, the pipe on the other. It's all quite complicated. There's a map of each field with its drainage system underneath it, which most people are entirely unaware of. There's another one. And there, of course, is the pipe going underneath the culvert or the bridge across into the field. So there's quite a lot of pipes here. And now we approach a bit of woodland on our right. This is called Middle Wood. And it's a largely deciduous block of woodland, which is one of dozens here on the estate. It's not really coppice woodland here, but it's on the edge of it. It's on the edge. There's bits of coppice woodland really quite close to here, across this field, in fact. On the other side of that field is a woodland that you can see in the distance. As we walk along, there's a gap in the hedge, it'll be more visible. And that is coppice woodland there. You can see where the road is. You can see the couple of some vehicles moving along there. Makes us feel rather superior going along on this green lane where we're nice and quiet. Bit of hedge here has been trimmed probably last year. You can see the 1 year's growth on the top. And we continue walking with Middlewood on our right. In the summer, this little section here with these trees covering over the path, it's a lovely shady spot on what's often a rather hot walk if you're actually out of the shade. So get into this bit and it's a refreshing break as you go along. So at the moment, I remind you, we're still on this Roman road, 33A, and now you would think that it would go straight on down here ahead of you, but oh no, it doesn't do that. It actually goes off to the right at an angle, which is still a footpath after 2,000 years, and it's a footpath which goes across probably what was once meadow. It's now an arable field, but we have to maintain it as a footpath, so you can see that we've sprayed out the crop along the route of the footpath. And you can perfectly well go along there. I think it's not as interesting now as going along the hedge line, which is what we all do. But if you think that's actually the route of the Roman road now. So from now on, we're going to be going away from the Roman road. And this bit of hedge line, I actually planted this myself in an effort to join up these various green lanes. I did this 40 odd years ago with the help of the son of our forester at the time, and the two of us had quite a hard job planting the trees because this ground is used as a route for vehicles. It gets very compacted. It's a road effectively, and we were effectively trying to plant these hedging plants into the road, and it was a time when people hadn't really established the systems for doing this, we had to create the little tree guards which we talked about earlier to protect the hedge. We actually had to get great big long tree guards which were designed for tall trees, and we had to chop them up into bits and use those to plant the hedge into. I'm trying to see if I can find any of those now. I'm glad to see really that they've all disappeared, and there has been some little bits of gapping up done in here since, but basically this is the hedge that we planted, and we planted these trees as well. So this has become a link in this system of green lanes. To our right front, you can see the far end of Mouse Lane, which is the second of the green lanes. We're on Whitebridge Lane. It's called Whitebridge because I'm sure in the old days when the Roman road went off to the right that we were looking at, it would cross in the valley bottom there, a tiny valley by our standards, there's a stream, and in wet weather that gets quite full, and they would have had to make some form of a bridge across that. And so I think actually the name Whitebridge Lane is very ancient because it actually associates with that crossing point which is no longer actually part of the lane. So we're on the little linky section here with these 40-year-old oaks, which I have to say are doing quite well. I'm pleased to see that. And we're approaching Mouse Lane. Ahead of us, there's a gap in the hedge where we can go through. We'll then be turning left. This is a crossing point of several fields. So a field on the left there, and then a field beyond the hedge line, this field on the right. But we're now turning around. Well, I'm now going to actually unravel the Bolly's lead, which has got slightly wrapped around me, so we'll do a complete 360-degree pan round. You can see there aren't many houses visible except in the distance beyond this hedge line, and that's houses of Newthorpe and Mouse Lane. Now we're in Mouse Lane ancient green lane, and we've got this fabulous tree on the right front with its ivy and its bole and its branches. It's obviously another pollarded tree from all those years ago, which, to keep it going, we still sometimes have to re-pollard them again. But the difficulty is that these days it's so easy to cut the branches off a tree with a chainsaw that the temptation is to take all the branches off at the same time, and unfortunately it gives the tree a terrible shock. In the old days, it would have been massively difficult for probably two people with a long two-handled saw on ladders to have cut one branch off, and it might have taken them half a day or something to cut this branch off. And so there's every reason why they wouldn't go around and do all the branches. They wouldn't have owned the tree, they would have had the right to do the pollarding, and I'm sure they would have got into trouble if they'd taken too much. So all the pressures and influences went towards the objective of not taking too many branches off. And we have to learn from that, and if we try to do it again now, you just have to take a branch off here and there and leave the rest of the tree. We're turning right now into another part of the Green Lane system, which is still called Mouse Lane. Mouse Lane is a sort of combination of two different bits of lane, a sort of T-shaped system. And then Whitebridge Lane joins into that from the other side. There's a great hollow trunk. See right through it, see the daylight out the other side. That's a wonderful example of fallen dead wood rotting away in the way that one wants it to. It's certainly not unsightly. This path gets narrower as we go along because it sort of curiously seems to have a hedge line growing up the middle of it, at this point approaching us in 20 metres maybe, and that itself has trees and things growing in it, which have been doing that for 60, 80 years maybe. And some purists might say one ought to cut them down to widen the whole thing out, but I think that would be a terrible shame. And so we leave this as a narrow bit of footpath now. And what it's doing is creating a really wide double hedge, effectively. You can see the old trackway running down the middle of it. There's a great big block of holly here, which of course in the winter is such an important feature of the landscape. Giving shelter, berries for birds, decorations for Christmas of course, and a lot of ancient mythology. This narrow path has got a steep drop on the left. It's really quite surprisingly steep, and then holly on the right, and then this ancient oak tree covered in ivy, both holly and ivy here, on the left. And then you see down here 15 feet down to the bottom of that bank. Really quite unexpected, because there's a bit of a hollow in the land on the far side, and it's how the two things have resolved themselves. But on the right here you can see quite a steep bank along the hedge line. Just saw a female blackbird go through the hedge there, underlining the importance of it for wildlife. Goes on. Path's opening up a little bit now, more or less to its full width. Wind's getting up as well. I can begin to hear it. I don't know if you can hear it. I'm about to say I'm well wrapped up with hat, gloves and scarf, so I feel fairly impervious. It was commented that Bolly hasn't got his coat on today, and certainly when we set off it wasn't needed. But I think by the time we get back to the barn, he'll be quite glad to get into the shelter. Still relatively warm day actually. It's about 5 or 6 degrees. Here's a trackway leading through into the field. With dog's leg in the Green Lane system. Walk walk around as we make our way towards the bottom end of Mouse Lane. Yet another holly tree marking the landscape. There's an ancient tradition that you never cut down a holly tree, and certainly in the old days, if you asked a farm worker to cut one down, he would probably turn around and refuse, and good for him. These days people probably are less aware of that, but more aware of it from an environmental viewpoint. So the effect is the same, that the holly trees tend to survive in the landscape. Sometimes in the days of these dreadful hedge clearances, the line of an old hedge would still have the hollies left in it, everything else removed, but the hollies would stay. A curiosity really of a previous era. I can hardly say it was good. I mean, it was good that they didn't cut the holly, but obviously they shouldn't have cut any of it. Values change. We all try to do what we feel is right in our own times, and so fashions alter, and we do our best to look after the place in the best way we can by the standards of our own times. Here we get to the bottom of the Mouse Lane. The hedge has gone on the left. I have been wondering about replanting that. I think it would be rather nice to try and fill that gap up. And of course on the right we now begin to get some houses which are also called Mouse Lane. We look at the field on the left, which is the view they get from the houses, across to another hedge line full of oaks, almost all of them covered in ivy. Keep walking along here, coming right to the end of the Mouse Lane route. There was a magpie, I don't know if you would have seen it, which is full of its own superstitions. I normally doff my hat, my finger, and say good morning Mr. Magpie when I see one. If you see two, they bring you luck, so you don't say it. And beyond two it gets really quite complicated. The whole thing of course is rather nonsensical, but I am a bit superstitious, so it's a superstition that I try to keep going. Now we're approaching Mouse Lane Road with its own sign. We walk down the pavement here. Pavement on both sides, but because of where we'll be crossing the road at the bottom, this left-hand side is a better route to take. Shortens the crossing of the public road at the bottom. It's amazing the shapes that some of these oak trees create. Some of these branches are virtually growing into one another. A sort of tangle of branches, which my father would have been horrified by, because he would grow timber with a view to, or he'd grow trees with a view to harvesting them for timber in the future, and you would want the branches all to grow outwards. It quite amuses me to see the branches growing inwards in a sort of crazy crossover fashion. And these days we're not just growing trees for timber, we're growing them for the landscape, for the environment, and that sort of thing. And so it sort of doesn't really matter in the same way. And if the tree isn't a huge timber value, it probably won't get cut down, which is going to protect it for the future. Some allotments here on the left. It's not the finest time of year to view allotments between seasons like this, but they are very well maintained later on in the year, and a lot of vegetables and flowers are produced from them. Coming up to public road, I can hear a car coming from the right. We have to be a bit cautious along here. There it goes. And now if we stand here waiting for a clear thing, you can see the path on the other side, the dog poo bin. That's what we head for. Safely over. And we're heading back for towards the Blackthorpe Avenue now. It's getting to the very last section of this walk. It's lots of fallen dead wood here too. In the old days, I would have been responsible for getting people to clear all this up, but I've learnt better now. So we keep the front edge tidy along the public road, but further back we allow the wood to lie and rot. People coming to and from the Blackthorpe barn, probably using, I hope they're using Roots Cafe. Having perhaps had morning coffee, meeting friends or something like that. And now we pan round just to have a little look at the avenue in both directions. There's more traffic coming here than on the public road actually, which is I'm quite pleased to see. And now the last section here, walking back to the barn. A lot of these trees were hugely badly damaged during the gales of '87, and we've allowed suckers and things like that to grow up since then to create a replacement avenue really. There's an amazing hollow trunk here on the left, which you just have a quick look at as you go past. This is a lime. You see the hole. Go around this way, you can see right through it, right up and out the top. There was quite a lot of tree on top of that until the other year, when we realised quite how hollow that one was, and we had to take the top out for safety reasons. Quite a skilled job to not damage that very delicate bit at the bottom. There's a hugely bushy lime tree ahead now, creating all that sort of depth of sticks and twigs and branches that create a wonderful habitat. And here's another hollow lime with bracket fungus growing from it. And on the left front, another another line with lots of branches. Ahead, one that's just a sort of stump, still alive. And as we swing round, we see that we've arrived back at the Blackthorpe Barn. And our walk is coming to its end. So, that is the Lake Meadows walk in its totality. One of my favourite walks and one of Bolly's favourite walks. Here's the Blackthorpe Barn, and I think this walk is now coming to an end. Thank you.